I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell. Welcome to this episode of On Watch. If you care about voter fraud and election integrity, and finally getting some level of justice with respect to the Clinton email scandal investigation, you want to stay tuned to this episode of On Watch, because today we're very fortunate to have two attorneys from Judicial Watch, my friend and colleague Ramona Kotka, senior attorney with Judicial Watch, who's handling matters concerning the Clinton email investigation, and also my friend and colleague Robert Popper, who is the director of Judicial Watch's Election Integrity Program or project. Welcome to both of you. Glad that you joined us here today. We've got some very important legal developments just in the last week that relate directly to the Clinton email investigation. And likewise, in the last couple of weeks, we've had some big developments with respect to our entire election integrity program, both on the voter fraud, election integrity side of the equation, but also with respect to an effort in California concerning ballots. We're going to talk about both of those topics today in depth. So let's start off first with the Clinton email. I'm going to call it a scandal because it's been ongoing now for years. Ramona, there was a hearing just last week in front of Judge Royce Lamberth here in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, and the hearing had to do with something called discovery.
Yes.
Our viewers may not know what discovery is necessarily, but it's a legal means by which we gather evidence and information.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the hearing and what Judge Lamberth ruled on.
Sure. So discovery is a fact-finding process that attorneys use. And in the case that we have against the State Department, it's actually a FOIA case. It's a Freedom of Information Act case for records relating to Benghazi talking points. We asked for these records back in 2014 from the Secretary's office.
So this is a 5-year case,
Yes.
so 5 years of litigation to find out about this case.
Yes. And we, throughout the process, obviously, we had previously requested that the judge or that the court grant us discovery because there was evidence of bad faith by the State Department with respect to this case, and not telling us that they were missing Secretary Clinton's emails at the same time they were trying to settle the case with Judicial Watch.
Okay, this is an important point, so I want to pause for a second and focus on the idea of bad faith on the part of the government with respect to producing these emails to us. I think for context, it's important to remember that this is actually our second case concerning Hillary Clinton's emails at the State Department and actually her outlaw server where she ran all these emails. Another judge, Judge Emmett Sullivan, in a separate piece of litigation, also granted us discovery.
Correct.
How unusual is it for a judge to grant discovery in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit?
It's very unusual. Discovery is rare in FOIA. Typically, the courts and the judges will give deference to the agency's declarations, which just means submissions under oath in writing to the court, where they searched and that they did everything they're supposed to do.
So when you mention bad faith with respect to that, in regular, normal English terms, what is the judge getting at when he talks about a question of bad faith?
Well, the question of bad faith is honesty to the court and to Judicial Watch, the plaintiff. If you're trying, the State Department in this case came and told Judicial Watch in November of 2014, we've searched for all the records. Here are 4 documents, which we've actually received in a previous FOIA case. And we've done everything we can. Would you like to settle the case? All the while knowing at that point the State Department had already asked for Secretary Clinton's emails, and several weeks later they received 12 banker boxes of her emails, and they were trying to settle. So it's dishonesty. That's pretty much, if I were to use one word.
Bob, you've been an attorney at the Justice Department in your past life before
Yes.
joining Judicial Watch.
Yes.
What sort of emotion does it elicit within the Justice Department when a judge raises a question of bad faith?
People remember it for decades. It's extremely rare.
Right.
It's a career ender a lot of times. I don't know what the ramifications have been here, but you also got, Ramona, you got sworn testimony discovery. I mean, we say discovery. They had to produce people, right, who you got
Yes.
to depose under oath. I mean, that's remarkable.
It's an
right?
extraordinary lineup of folks also. People within Mrs. Clinton's circle, folks like Cheryl Mills, Huma Abedin. I don't know that our viewers appreciate that not only is it extraordinary to get discovery in these matters, but the fact of taking live depositions or testimony from these
Right.
folks under oath, it's remarkable. So back to our hearing, we asked for some folks to be deposed, and tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So I'm sorry, I gave you a little bit of background because at the hearing, we had already concluded, Judge Lamberth had granted us in the winter, in December and January, permission to depose about 10 or 11 witnesses in this case. And then he said at the end of that, come back and we'll see if there's additional discovery that Judicial Watch needs. And so that's where we were last week. We presented the court to the court a list of witnesses, additional witnesses that we need to depose because of additional new information that we found in the discovery that had taken place in the last 6 months.
So this first set of depositions, these questions under oath, actually unearth new information, new
Yes.
facts.
Yes.
And that actually drives the second request where we say, look, we need to talk to more people because as we dig at this, new facts are popping up that we need to.
Right.
Right.
And as Judge Lambert said at the hearing, actually the new information really raises a lot more questions than it did answers. And so Judge Lambert granted us just about all of the discovery we requested except for 2 depositions.
And those 2
We'll get to
depositions
those.
are, who are they?
Secretary Clinton and her former Chief of Staff, Cheryl Mills. The judge, their attorneys were present at the hearing and they requested that they have 30 days to respond to Judicial Watch's request, and Judge Lamberth granted that, and their responses will be due, I believe, September 23rd, and then we'll have 10 days to submit a reply as to why we need their depositions, and then Judge Lamberth, I suspect, will rule on that in fairly short order.
So as a non-attorney, I can tell you sitting in the courtroom, it was my impression at least, that this is pretty astounding stuff, that this is really a remarkable advance in clearing up. I mean, look, my impression in my past life, I was a counterintelligence officer and I've done national security crime investigations. I'm not guessing at this, I know firsthand how it's done. And I know how the Clinton email investigation was conducted. Mm-hmm. And I know that Mr. Comey, when he gave his briefing on the 5th of July, 2016, invented something entirely new with respect to the criminal code concerning mishandling of national defense information. And that is he injected into the formula, which does not exist in the law, this idea of intent. And so I think part of what our efforts to get these records really go to is intent. And that's sort of this fabrication that Mr. Comey, I mean, he fabricated it and then he lied about it. The efforts of our litigation to get these records, I think, again, outside looking in, not an attorney, but I noticed sort of the tone and tenor of the attorneys representing the Justice Department and the State Department, the government attorneys. I think that they are not simply discussing the production of records. To me, it's a very sort of emotional, agenda-filled defense where it's not a dispassionate argument over records and what the law requires or doesn't require. I get the impression that they're trying to win, not produce records, not necessarily be forthcoming about what they have or what they don't have when they learn they had it, but they're fighting, and not again, my impression, not in the sense of just making a good legal argument, but this is the Justice Department and the State Department, in my opinion, really doing all they can to cover up for Mrs. Clinton. And when I watch that and see that, it's a head scratcher for me because I don't know if Attorney General Barr knows that. I certainly don't know if the president knows that or not. But this is a really pretty fundamental issue with respect to a person setting up a email server outside the government channels, sending lots of classified information across it. And it's just sort of a yes or no, do you have the records or not? And it's gotten very muddled since then.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, Bob, you know, in the course of your experience as a Justice Department attorney, I know that sometimes people get invested in cases. You know, they get very emotional and very personally dedicated into a particular case. But you have, again, you're not you're not an attorney on this case, but you have an informed opinion on these things.
Yeah.
Have you
I
seen?
think I may drop Justice Department from my resume.
Have you seen this level of sort of?
Of course, and it can get very strange. I mean, people view the Justice Department and their residence in the government as some sort of personal, their bailiwick or where they're supposed to be.
Right.
And decisions are made based on what your friends want and what your enemies don't want. And
Right.
it can get crazy. And I mean, I don't know, but it sounds like something a little crazy is going on.
A little, I mean, I would say, so Judge Lamberth asked for the parties to submit in writing the day before as to what the positions are.
Right.
And to be honest with you, it really did surprise me that the State Department's position was absolutely no discovery, because there was some very important information that we found in the previous discovery that goes to an inquiry in 2013 that the State Department had made with respect to Secretary Clinton's emails, a directive that was issued in August of 2013, and this is all from the deposition of former State Department official John Hackett,
Right.
where he said, we need to find out what Secretary Clinton's email practices were before we send any more responses to any FOIA requesters and say that relate to her emails and say we don't have any records. So that's part of, I mean, those facts are highly relevant. This is a year before, well before our FOIA request.
Right.
So that's very relevant to the claims that Judicial Watch has in this case. And we are asking even for the records that pertain to that directive, for example.
So
and
I think the idea is here that State Department officials had guilty knowledge, my term, my language, had sort of guilty knowledge of what was really going on. We're sort of scrambling to deal with it, and then when caught, in my view, covered up on this. And that's what's really sort of behind all this, is that there's a lot of baggage that gets dragged out because of the questions that we've asked.
Well, it is, but their position is pretty much, what difference does it make? You know,
We've heard that expression before.
right?
We've heard that expression before. Bob, I want to shift for a second. We're going to circle back to the Clinton email story in a second. But Bob, there's been some pretty important events in the last few weeks with respect to voter fraud, voter registration rolls, and election integrity. And in particular, what comes to mind, of course, is California and Kentucky. So, in my view, when the voter rolls are dirty or when they're loaded up with people that aren't alive or whatever, the vote itself, the election, can be called into question. Yeah. Talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we've come up with in the last few weeks.
Well, we have a project to sue and to pursue lawsuits under the National Voter Registration Act. And, stop me if I get too much like a lawyer, but basically, it's a statute that everyone knows is the motor voter bill.
Right.
This is Clinton's bill. You can register at the Department of Motor Vehicles, and the trade-off was there's a provision that states have to take care of their voter rolls. They have to make sure that people who've died, people who moved out of state, maybe years, maybe decades before, are no longer on the voter rolls. And it seems that the first part is scrupulously adhered to, and the integrity provision is instantly ignored.
So register everybody you can, but once you have, make sure the voter rolls are accurate, true, complete, current, the information's correct.
Well, the best example of this is our California lawsuit. I mean, the Clinton Justice Department, the same Clinton administration that helped pass the motor voter bill, in 1998 told the state of California, we will sue you unless you agree that you can't remove people under this particular set of conditions, which is that you send them a letter and they don't respond. The problem is that the law says you can remove them or start to remove them after a couple of elections if they don't respond to the letter. And so they were telling the state of California to ignore their own state laws and to do something contrary to the text of the statute under their strange reading of it. So almost immediately you have a Democratic administration making war on the statute. Now, in 2003, the law was amended just to make clear that the way they thought about it was wrong. Okay, but that consent decree was still out there and it was still acted on by California. Well, fast forward to 2017, the state hadn't enforced the National Voter Registration Act the way it was supposed to be enforced in 20 years.
Right.
There are 5 million active registrants in Los Angeles County. On top of that, there are 1.5 million inactive registrants. These are overwhelmingly likely to be people who moved somewhere else. You know,
Or died, or any other
over the
number
course of 20 years,
whichever.
they could have moved to 5 states, they could have moved to Europe.
Sure.
They could be dead, okay? And so what we told them was that we're suing you, you haven't enforced the National Voter Registration Act, you have to start sending letters and removing people pursuant to the statute, and they agreed to do it. And I guess, you know, it's one thing to agree to do it, it's another thing to actually start acting. Well, in the past couple of weeks, they sent 1.6 million cards to people who are believed to move to other states. Now, we have to start at square one because they haven't done anything in 20
Right.
years.
So, I mean, the fact that they
Yeah.
even picked their heads up for a moment and took this first initial step is a huge
well,
victory.
you know, and it's not all that we want, but the law is you can't just yank people off
You
the
gotta
voter rolls,
start
and that's
somewhere.
not a bad law.
You gotta start
That's a good law.
Kentucky, though, is another case or another situation where about
Same kind of situation.
40% of the county voter rolls had this outrageous number of people registered to vote over adults that were actually
Yeah.
resident in the counties.
Well, that's what we look for. Every couple of years, the Election Assistance Commission, it's a federal agency, puts out its survey of every state and every state's query of every county. That's the theory. You don't always get all the states. You don't always get all the counties,
Right.
but you get enough to work with. And we hire a professional demographer, someone who knows his way around the census numbers. And what we're looking for is counties where the registration rate exceeds 100%, because that's hard to defend.
Sure.
And so what you're looking for is counties where the number of voter registrations is larger than the number of citizens over the age of 18 who could register under the law. Well, Kentucky, as you said, it had 48 counties out of 120 were underwater, so to speak. They had more registrations than citizens who
And of
were
course,
eligible to register.
None of this is a surprise to local election officials who know what their voter rolls say.
Well, right, yes. And it's not a surprise, first in California, where you just don't enforce the law for a couple of decades. It wasn't a surprise in Kentucky, where Secretary of State Grimes hadn't enforced the law since 2012, claiming a lack of money, a lack of funds. You know, it was a different type of situation. They didn't have a pass from the Clinton Justice Department,
Right.
but all the same, they just didn't enforce the law. And after a couple of years, you know, voter rolls start to go bad immediately. People die, people move all the time.
Sure.
You know, so you leave it alone since 2012, and you're going to have a mess, and that's what they've had.
So
Now they
just
sent
to-
out 250,000
Okay.
cards, smaller state, smaller registration. The entire state is smaller than the county of Los Angeles.
Right.
But you know, that's progress. That's 7% of their voter rolls.
So
received a
it's
card.
an imperfect example, but rough math.
Yeah.
That's about 2 million votes or 2 million voters that
Just
in
under.
theory are not accurately, correctly, truthfully accounted for on rolls. Either
Yes,
they're-
and every one of them is going to get the due process
Sure.
under the law. They get a card. Even if they don't respond, they don't get removed for 2 general federal elections. But I'll tell you from experience, in Ohio, for example,
Right.
99.5% of the people who got cards live somewhere else. I mean, in Los Angeles County, we expect the number to be about the same. These are just people who the state has lost track of. Now, if you're on the inactive list, and here's the problem with having a big inactive list, you can still vote. You don't need to produce, you know, ID, an affidavit, or anything. You can go, unless it's an ID state, but you can just go in and say, I'm here, and they'll say, well, you're on the inactive list. And no, that's where I live. Then you get to vote. So that 1.5 million, those registrations can be voted unless they're taken off the voter
So
roll.
any sort of hysterical claims of disenfranchisement, and
No.
they're hysterical, at least in my view, that they're exaggerated. It's not. This is just a matter of having accurate, complete, full
Well, this
information.
is common sense. You know, it's federal law. It's common sense. It came in with motor voter. We want to register a lot of people. We want to remove everyone who's not on the rolls. I don't see anything disenfranchising about that statutory scheme. Neither did Congress. You know, and also, I mean, I always like to add, that if you're tossed off the voter rolls, rightly or wrongly, this is not a life-altering event. This is not like a house fire or a tree falls
Sure.
on your car. You go and re-register. You go to the clerk's office and you're registered again, you can vote.
And when we come back in just a moment, we're going to go back into the Hillary Clinton email litigation, and we're going to talk some more about voter fraud, voter rolls, voter integrity. So stick with us. Welcome back to On Watch. I'm your host, Chris Farrell, and I'm joined today by my colleagues and friends, both Judicial Watch senior attorneys, Ramona Kotka and Bob Popper. So where we left off, we were talking about some election integrity things, but I can't let go of the Clinton email server. So we're going to circle back to that for just a second. Okay. And I think historical perspective is important, right? You have to contextualize things. And this isn't just about Judicial Watch screaming about an email server. I think understanding sort of the chronology and sequence of events here is absolutely critical to understanding why it's so important, not just from the national security crime aspect of having classified information go across an unsecured, non-governmental outlaw server. But this whole saga begins, believe it or not, with Benghazi. How does Benghazi relate to a question or a FOIA lawsuit or depositions being taken over Mrs. Clinton's email server?
So this, right after the Benghazi attacks, that Sunday, then Ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, appeared on Sunday morning talk shows.
5 of them, if my memory serves correctly.
Correct. I believe that's correct, yes.
That's an indoor record, I believe.
Where basically she stated that blaming the attacks not on being a terrorist attack, but rather a YouTube video,
right?
An inflammatory YouTube video that had come out, and we all saw the Benghazi attacks on TV, as it was happening, and the coverage that we saw. So shortly thereafter, Judicial Watch filed a lawsuit, our first Benghazi talking points case, for records relating to the talking points that were provided to Susan Rice for the morning talk shows. That FOIA request was actually submitted just to her office at the State Department. And once we did receive, that's the case actually where we received what we now know as the Ben Rhodes memo,
right?
Where there's the email communication saying to highlight that it's the YouTube video and not a policy failure by the administration.
And just as a refresher, Ben Rhodes was a senior operative, I think a deputy national security advisor, and he's sort of trying to synchronize or coordinate the various agencies and departments of the Obama administration. And he comes up with this concept or his own sort of theme or talking point about blame the YouTube video and not the failure of our policy,
right.
Which is an astoundingly frank comment to put in an email, but nonetheless, Mr. Rhodes did that. And I think it points to really sort of the underlying current, the political objectives of what was going on.
Right. And actually, so when we received, that was the first documentation that had come out. And I mean, obviously at that point, the Congress had already initiated its own investigations, but there wasn't anything linking or showing that the White House was involved with that strategy,
right.
And that position. And this was the first evidence that we had of that. And that's what actually, I believe it was almost the same day or the same week that the Benghazi Select Committee was formed, or shortly thereafter, as a result of the email that was released in our case. Once we settled that case, and once that case was concluded, we said we actually want to see the communications about the talking points from Secretary Clinton's office at the time. And that's what brings us to May actually of 2014, when we filed the second talking points case.
Right.
But that one was specific to Secretary Clinton's office. In July, the State Department didn't respond substantively to our FOIA request, so we had to file a lawsuit in July of 2014. And then in November is when the State Department came back and said, we've searched for the records and this is what we have. When I mentioned before, the 4 records that they found were actually previously produced in our first
Right.
Benghazi talking points case. And we looked at them and we're like, there are no emails with Secretary Clinton in here. So we
This is what I refer to in shorthand terms as Mrs. Clinton is the hole in the donut, right? There's all these people talking about Benghazi, what was going on, all the different agencies and departments and key figures you would imagine talking about what's going on. And there's this conspicuous absence of communications and emails with respect to Secretary Clinton. And that's the, hey, wait a minute, why is there nothing here on the record?
Right, right. And so at that point, the State Department actually also produced a draft bond, which is a legal term in the FOIA world.
And that's essentially a list of here's what we're not going to give you and why.
Exactly. It's
Right.
just explaining the FOIA has certain exemptions and explaining why the agency is withholding that information. We looked at that and, we said, we're actually looking for, Secretary Clinton had an email, so we're actually going to ask for a search declaration. Describe to us what you searched. This was in December of 2014, and this was in conversations because the State Department had initiated trying to settle the case.
And of course, just for plain English, when an agency tries to settle the case, they just want it to go away.
Right, to dismiss.
Stop asking questions.
Yeah.
So that's really what their sort of goal or objective is. Let's just make this all stop. I think it's key that you mentioned it's the timing on that, because we now know that on the 5th of December, I think my date's correct, 12 bankers' boxes, 12 loads of records from Mrs. Clinton were delivered to the State Department.
The same day, and actually several hours before, the State Department gave us the draft bond.
Right. So, again, I'll go back to it's my phrase, my terminology. There's guilty knowledge here. There's people who know things, and yet they're somehow saying, well, we just didn't really appreciate or understand, and there's a lot of sort of dissembling, at least in my evaluation.
Right. And so this was in December, and we said, we actually want an explanation of where you searched for records. In February, the State Department comes back to us and says, you know what, we need to search some more emails. Didn't identify the emails or what the source of records that they were, needing to look at. And they said, but we'll be done by April. So we said, okay. So we filed a status report, a joint status report with the court. Fast forward a few weeks is when the New York Times article comes out on March 2nd, I believe, revealing the server that she had used and the emails that she used
So
exclusively.
we do this little history lesson because it's critical to contextualize this and to put it in sort of a chronology.
Right.
Because when you look at Mr. Comey's sort of absolution of Mrs. Clinton on the 5th of July, 2016, think about the consequences if he had not. Let's say, just for fun, he does his evaluation and he correctly concludes that she was in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 793F, which is mishandling national defense information. And he makes a referral, they have a grand jury, Mrs. Clinton's indicted. I mean, that would be the normal progression. As we enter essentially the fall of 2016, the ramp up to the election, it would be Donald J. Trump, controversial non-establishment Republican, versus indicted national security crime suspect Hillary Clinton.
And she still would have carried California.
You are
Still
correct.
thought.
And in that instance, I believe, and this is why you see these sort of frantic text messages from Peter Strzok and Lisa Page and the rest of the seditious conspirators at the FBI, that's why you see them frantically doing what they're doing, in my opinion, because they need to muddy up Mr. Trump, because they realize that they're, at least what appears to be their candidate based on their text messages, Mrs. Clinton, was on the cusp, on the verge of being indicted as a national security crime suspect, going to trial for mishandling of highly classified, and we're not talking about, oh gee, she left a memo on her desk. This is top secret, sensitive compartmented information, some special access programs. It's the highest of the highest classified information that we know went across her server. It can't be ignored, because when you look at how the FBI handled that investigation, in my opinion, having done this, it was a sham investigation. It was politically motivated. They were writing their findings in the spring We know Mr. Comey had drafts of something, I think it was from May. They didn't even interview her to the 2nd of July, and he absolved her on the 5th of July. So the timing on this is absolutely critical with respect to the production of records, our litigation, and sort of the outside factors, other things that were going on in this sort of walk up to the 2016 election. And that's how you get to the next sort of segment of the scandal, which is the insurance policy, right? This is Strzok, Page, Comey, for that matter, Brennan, Clapper saying, oh my goodness, if this guy Trump actually does get elected, we still have to be able to take him out. And that, I mean, you can draw a line from Benghazi all the way up to the Russia hysteria. And I don't think folks always view it that way, but there really is a connection. When we come back in just a second, we're going to come back to our friend Bob Popper and talk about voter fraud, election integrity, and a lot of other important work that Judicial Watch is doing. Stay with us. Welcome back to On Watch. We're talking about voter fraud, election integrity, and the Hillary Clinton email server case, which Judicial Watch is digging in on both topics. We have two great experts with us. Bob, I want to get back for a second to talk about some of these election integrity project, what I view to be huge wins, and that has to do, of course, we've talked a little bit about California and Kentucky, but there's some other litigation that we're bringing in California on another matter, not necessarily related to voter rolls, but on the election process and ballots themselves. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in California.
Sure. Well, California doesn't like Donald Trump. And Donald Trump said he won't release his tax returns. He hasn't released them. He won't release them prior to 2020. That's his position. And so California thought, the legislature, let's pass a law saying in order to run in the primaries in California, you have to release 5 years worth of tax returns. And the Secretary of State then has to post them online. Okay, and if you don't do that, you cannot be in the primary.
Would that affect any Democratic contenders?
It would affect 3.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
Joe Biden just released his. It used to be 4, but it would affect Tulsi Gabbard, Julian Castro, and Mr. Yang.
So does California have the authority to supersede the requirements of a federal election for president?
It turns out that they don't. There's a couple of qualifications clauses in the United States Constitution, one for the president, one for congresspersons. And the one for the president says you have to be of a certain age, you have to be a citizen for so long, and just rock solid Supreme Court precedent for years has indicated that that's that.
Otherwise, states, any number of states, could make up any sort of rules they wish to.
Sure.
Like, you can't run for president if your
election,
if your initials are DJT. Or,
right. But you know what the Supreme Court rationally has determined is that the rights of voters are tied up with the rights of candidates. You know, if you start restricting who can run on silly reasons or even for plausible reasons, and I don't think this is a plausible reason, you start to hurt the voters who want to vote for them.
And so we have plaintiffs, we have clients with respect to this California litigation.
Yes. Now, Donald Trump has sued. The California Republican Party has sued. And I mentioned his name because it's no secret that that's what this is really about. It was designed to hurt him. However, we don't represent him. He's not our client. We have 4 voters that we represent, 2 Republican and a Democrat and an independent. And the Democrat might vote for someone who will be restricted from the primary because they haven't released their tax returns. And that's unfair to them, it's unfair to the Republican, it's unfair to the independent, whose field of candidates is narrowed. And so we started a lawsuit, and we're moving for a preliminary injunction, which is we want to enjoin this law through the next election cycle. And, and I just have to tell you, the most indicative fact you can think about in terms of this case is that the California legislature tried to pass a similar law a couple of years ago, 2 years ago. And nonpartisan legislative counsel for the California legislature said, it is our opinion that this is unconstitutional, that it violates the qualifications clause. And they passed it anyway. And we have that letter. I mean, it's,
so their own counsel is telling them, don't do this.
Their own counsel is saying this is unconstitutional.
Right.
They pass it. Governor Jerry Brown vetoes it and says there are constitutional problems with this law. You can't restrict the number of candidates who are running.
Governor Gavin Newsom, though, somehow doesn't feel constrained by those arguments. Or
He saw past those constitutional problems to the greater good or whatever he was thinking. But no, he didn't have those problems with the bill.
didn't somebody say they wanted to send a message or they wanted to make a point? Or there's language like that out there about just kind of manipulating the system to
Look,
score a point.
I'm sure there is. This is virtually a publicity stunt.
Right.
I mean, if your own counsel publicly tells you that you don't have the right under the U.S. Constitution to do something, then that's an indication that it's probably a bad idea. Now, I think, in all honesty, I don't know what's in other people's heads, but I think they passed this law knowing that there would be multiple lawsuits and it would be struck down as unconstitutional. I think perhaps the idea is to disadvantage particular candidates who might, be the incumbent president of the United States in future elections. I've also heard an interesting take, which is that if Trump were not on the top of the ticket on the Republican side, California has what they call a jungle primary, which is that the top two vote getters proceed in any primary, even if they're both Democrats, even if, as might happen, they're both Republicans. And if Trump were off the top of the ticket, the top two in all the down ballot races would be Democrats. And I've heard that. It's hard to know that certainly would be the effect, but I just can't believe that anyone didn't think that this would be struck down.
That's an incredibly important description you just gave about how that primary system works, this jungle is the term that's
primary.
used, because that has a much broader impact than I think most people really appreciate, how the primary can really steer the outcome. It's not a straight up pick your best or favorite choice of whatever two or three parties.
Candidate. No.
Yeah,
Right.
this is a party-driven operation.
No, in California, they routinely have two Democrats running against each other for a, statewide or national seat.
And I don't think that's well appreciated, just like it isn't well appreciated, the efforts, I think, across the country and in several states to essentially nullify the Electoral College. Another topic for another day, but that's a very important issue that I don't think most voters really have a good appreciation for.
Sure.
When we come back in just a second, we're going to talk about what you can do in your community, your county, your state, as we approach election time just about a year from now. Stay with us. Thanks for joining us on Watch. I'm Chris Farrell, joined by my colleagues Ramona Kotka and Bob Popper. As we march up to the election, we're just about a year out, a little more than a year out. I can tell you that I have heard from all sorts of people across the spectrum, in public speaking engagements, through media, elsewhere, where they're worried, they're nervous about the electoral process because it seems to have been contentious. We have a history going back, of course, the most contentious recently, 2000, but marching forward at the state level, there's been fights over ballots and accuracy of the elections. But I hear people say that they are worried that the election is fair, complete, accurate, timely, all those sorts of good things that we want to have some sense of confidence and integrity in our elections. And they say, well, what can I do? Well, how do we react? And I always say to them, elections are essentially managed by the individual states. So there's 50 different answers to that question. But even more importantly, it's really handled at the county level. I mean, that's sort of where the mechanics, where the rubber meets the road in elections. So Bob, I know it's a big question because there's so many different variables on it. But if you're a concerned citizen, no matter where you fall on this political spectrum, no matter who your favorite candidate is, but you're interested in fair, complete, truthful, accurate elections, what can individual citizens do who are watching at home?
Well, that is a broad question. I mean, I'll give you a sort of nuts and bolts answer and then a bigger picture answer.
Sure.
I mean, the nuts and bolts of it, I would say become a poll watcher. I mean, work for your county. You sit behind the desk, you check people in. It helps in all these situations, whether or not there's voter ID in your particular state, whether or not there's a requirement for a photo ID in order to vote.
Right.
It helps if you're a member of the community and you know the people in your community. It creates a nicer atmosphere and you can be aware if something strange is going on. You'll have to look at state law, and I'm sure there are websites to help you become a poll worker. Poll worker is different from a poll watcher.
That's important. So there's a
Watches
poll
will-
watcher and a poll worker. Give us the difference.
Well, poll worker works for the state or works for the county. Poll watcher is a partisan, and there are special rules typically that apply to them as well. And they often, but not always, can challenge someone as, you don't live here, I didn't hear your name, But that there are other rules and restrictions with regard to them. You can become a poll watcher for your party. But these are important, crucial things. But, I would just say, also be aware of these issues. Judicial Watch is going to do its study. In fact, its study's been completed and we're assessing the results, in which we look at what I told you about earlier, which is which counties have more registered voters than they do citizens who could register. I would say, the national average is about 87. High 90s is a problem, but certainly over 100% shouldn't happen.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. When we make a press release or an announcement about what we found, and we start to send out letters telling people there's a problem, pay attention if it's your county. I mean, that would be one thing I'd encourage. And last segment, you also mentioned the National Popular Vote Compact. Look at what that is. There isn't probably enough time to go into that right now, but understand if your state has joined that compact. Because if you live in a small state and they succeed and our legal challenges don't take this bad idea down, then if you live in a small state, you will never see a candidate again. They will fly over your state. They will go to New York, California, Illinois, Florida, and they ain't coming to New Mexico anymore.
Now, this is an effort to defeat what's really the genius of our constitutional compromise.
Exactly right.
Where, at the time the Constitution's written, okay, New York and Virginia are big, strong, populous states, lots of people, lots of money, lots of political activity. But what about little Rhode Island, or little Connecticut, or little Delaware? And this was an attempt to strike the balance where, yes, everyone votes, and you're electing electors who then vote, but it was all sort of just like our Congress is established, right? The number of electors versus the members of Congress. Surprise, surprise, the numbers match. The idea was to strike this balance so that a handful of heavily populated, very wealthy states didn't crush smaller states, that there was proportional representation.
I mean, it's arisen partly by statute, partly by accident, partly by the federal Constitution, but the fact is simply this. What people have come to realize is that our system is not the most votes in the nation.
Right.
And your president. It's the most votes in the most places. And that makes sense because you have to pay attention to those places, especially for a polyglot country like ours.
And that's why you look at the map, you see that President Trump won something like 2,700 and something counties. Mrs. Clinton won about 690 counties.
Excellent point.
And that's the way to look at, okay, well, raw numbers versus, well, what part of the country did you win? And I think that's a great way to sort of analyze it. And then as a closing point, I'll just say, learn your state and county laws, procedures, rules for elections, because showing up to a protest 3 days later doesn't do you any good. You need to know what the rules in election are in your community. Stick with us, we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell, here with my colleagues Ramona Kotka and Bob Popper. As we close out today's show, I want to kind of hit a couple of important things. First, with respect to the Hillary Clinton email case and all that's sort of transpired there. We talked briefly about more depositions. You're going to have take some more sworn testimony of various officials. Can you give us a little rundown, besides, of course, Mrs. Clinton, who we've discussed, and Cheryl Mills, who you've already deposed? This would be a second effort to try to get her to be forthcoming and truthful. There are some other folks. Who else is sort of in the lineup?
One is the attorney who actually was a State Department attorney processing our FOIA request and in litigation.
Right.
That's very important because there's already evidence that he was aware of a large volume of Secretary Clinton's emails as early as August of 2014.
Wow.
And then we also have some more FOIA executive level officials at the State Department, Eric Stein, and also
There's also,
One is escaping.
I mean, as far as the actual lineup of folks, these are folks who had direct firsthand knowledge of what was being done with respect to these emails.
Yes.
And then there's also some document requests. We're looking for some more material that they should have.
Yes, actually, one of the document requests, Judge Lamberth permitted us to serve on Secretary Clinton and her attorneys for the after action memo. This was during her attorney's deposition of Heather Samuelson, where she testified that she memorialized the search and the review process when looking at through Secretary Clinton's emails to see what to return to the State Department.
There's one additional piece that I want to talk about, and that is there's a gentleman by the name of Paul Gambetta who's involved in the Hillary Clinton email server itself, had dealings with Platte River, the company that maintained the server. There's a very curious thing that Mr. Gambetta did, and of course he was granted immunity by the Justice Department, which I find astounding personally. But Gambetta is a guy who set up a email account called carterheavyindustries@gmail.com and essentially archived or dumped 30,000 some odd emails from Mrs. Clinton onto this Gmail account. Curiously, Carter Heavy Industries is the same name of a subsidiary of a Chinese firm. Right. And this has been the subject of a letter from Mr. Grassley. I know Representative Louis Gohmert in the House has looked into this. There's been some reporting in the Epoch Times on this. This is an extraordinarily unusual name for a computer consultant to suddenly come up with the title Carter Heavy Industries, right, and dump 30,000 emails into it, while at the same time, that's the name of a subsidiary of a Chinese firm. This is bizarre. And in that regard, my recollection of the hearing was Judge Lamberth directed Judicial Watch to shake the tree.
Yes. He would like to see us shake that tree. Senator Grassley had released the letters about and some of the interview notes relating to this the week before. So we didn't get into it too much at the hearing, but that is something that we're looking at.
So stay tuned.
Yes.
Bob, going forward, what do you, give me a little prediction.
I'm disturbed about that. I didn't know,
yeah?
I didn't know this story.
Give me a little tip as to what's coming up in the election integrity
What's the heavy
world.
in the Carter heavy industry? What do they make?
Heavy equipment is what it appears to be.
I'm sorry, all right. What's coming up in our world is, well, we're going to send around letters to people, to counties, to states that have registration rates exceeding 100%, telling them that, you know, that if they don't fix that, in 90 days we will take the same legal action we took against Los Angeles County and against Kentucky and against Maryland and a few other states.
So states and counties across the country, look for a letterhead memo from Bob Popper.
Yes.
And we'll see how that all turns out. I want to take this chance to thank all of you for tuning into On Watch. If you enjoy our programming, let us know. Thanks to you, Ramona. Thanks to you, Bob, for a great show. And hopefully you've learned more about not just all of our email efforts, but our election integrity efforts in giving you a deeper dive on the news than you'll see anywhere else. Thanks for joining us.